It was the 21st of June, 1921. A riotous troop in lorries came, armed with petrol bombs and guns. Revenge was on their bloody minds, all in a drunken spree, for the death of General Lambert, ambushed eastward of Loughree.
June 21st marks the centenary of a dark night in the history of our village. At 1 AM on that night, the village was set alight in a revenge attack for the killing of General Lambert. A case of mistaken identity resulted in all but 3 houses being burned to the ground. In order to tell the story, it's important to outline the events that led up to this cruel, malicious and unsanctioned attack. You'll hear many stories today that were handed down over the generations, and not all of them align. Unfortunately, it seems that the burning wasn't really talked about in any great detail in the village over the years, and definitely wasn't reported in any great detail. We've attempted to tell the story as best we can. The story starts with a man named Sean McKeown, and Jim Ganley, a local historian who has studied the burning in great detail, tells us more.
Sean McKeown, the leader of the IRA in County Longford. He was an iconic figure there, good leader. He was a member of the IRB, secret society, who ran most of the affairs of the IRA and did nearly all the fundraising for guns and ammunition. He was involved in a gunfight near Ballinallee in January 1921, where a detachment of British Army and RAC were approaching a house he was staying in. He was warned that they were coming, so he went outside the door and started firing his revolver, and he threw a Mills bomb. And when the dust had settled, he found that District Inspector McGrath was dead. Another RIC man was wounded, and he made good his escape through a hail of bullets. Obviously, from then on, he was a marked man, and he was wanted. He was then brought to a court-martial, and as a result, he was sentenced to death, a death sentence that was to be carried out 3 months after the verdict. Shortly after that, volunteers in Tubbaclare in County Westmeath were given the task of forming an ambush to capture a British Army general. And the idea was that if they caught a general, they would be able to trade him for Sean McKeown. So it was known through intelligence that General Lambert, the highest ranking British officer in the west of Ireland, he and a colleague, General Chandler, with their wives, used to go out on a regular basis to Kilnure House near Glasson to play tennis. They never varied their route, so it was, and never varied their times either. And the Tubbaclare men set up an ambush and met them on the return from Kilnure House to Athlone. And they came out into the road, pointed the guns at the car coming towards them. But General Lambert said to his wife, who was driving the car, to put her foot down, and they drove through. And even though there was shotgun pellets and bullets fired at them, they came through unscathed. But 50 yards down the road, another detachment of the Tubbaclare volunteers came out, again fired into the car, and this time General Lambert was mortally wounded in the neck, and Chandler's wife, who was in the back seat, she got pellets in the face. They returned to the barracks in Athlone. Medical attention was given to Lambert, but it failed. He died at between 9 and 9:30 that evening. And news rapidly went out through the barracks and also out to the RAC barracks that Lambert was killed. And the RAC and British Army went straight out to Coulson and Glasson, challenging local known IRA sympathisers to try and find out what had happened and who the perpetrators were. And one man literally pointed in the direction of Loughree, and he said, "I saw 2 men running across the fields towards Loughree." And they made the assumption that the attackers had come from the Connaught side of the lake, and he was actually pointing towards Gailey Bay, and the nearest built-up village to Gailey Bay was Knockcroghery. So in the early hours of the morning of the 21st of June, 1 AM, 3 carloads of tans arrived in Knockcroghery and proceeded to cause mayhem.
3 vehicles of tans and auxiliaries arrived in the village at around 1 AM that morning. It's estimated that 10 to 12 men arrived with a quantity of petrol stored in the boots of their cars. The attack started at Curley's clay pipe factory and shop. Curley's was one of 2 clay pipe factories in the village at the time. The tans spread across the village, creating mayhem, firing bullets into the air and setting fire to thatch roofs. A newspaper report at the time reports that Paddy John Curley said that he woke up to the sound of crashing glass, the door was broken in, a revolver was put in his face and he was forced out.
It being the hour past midnight, the village was asleep. The sky above was clear and bright, all peaceful in God's keep. Some light clouds drifted westward from Queen Maeve's final seat to herald in the solstice and the feast of St. John's Eve.
We know from evidence given by the parish priest Bartholomew Kelly that when they came to his house to tell him to get out and they told him that they're going to burn his house down, he looked out his bedroom window and he could hear the sounds of gunfire, he could see flames, so it's quite obvious that the village was already on fire. And it appears that they would have gone down to the centre of the village, dispersed and start to attack all the houses at the one time. And one of the residents, Patrick Curley, he woke to the sound of breaking glass. His front door was broken in, and when he went down to investigate, a gun was put in his face. He was told, "Get out, we're going to burn you out." So he gathered his wife and children. They went out through the back of the house and up the steep incline of Creggan Hill and landed at the door of the Church of Ireland vicar, Canon Humphreys.
On that night, they pretty much lost everything. They were set out in their night clothes. They hadn't time to gather anything and pretty much lost everything overnight. Well, it must have been a very, very scary night. If you can imagine somebody bursting down your door and burning your house down, and you were still in your night clothes and you had to run up Hangman's Hill to get away from it. It must have been a very, very traumatic night. But luckily, nobody was killed. And the family that lived here, the Curleys, did actually not too badly out of it because they got compensation since they had a business and were able to show their books, but it was a very traumatic time.
The manufacture of clay pipes was a massive source of employment in the village historically, with many families in the trade and living in the village. At its peak, there were 8 factories manufacturing thousands of pipes a week. Although the industry had shrank by 1921 due to the production of cigarettes, the burning of the village was to be the final death nail for the industry.
Well, PJ was the last, ran the last pipe factory here, along with his father Andrew, and they had several workers. And at one time before this Knockcroghery was a huge centre for pipe making, and most people that lived in the village had some connection with it. But the Curleys were the last in a long line. But that was the end of the pipe making, and it was a big, big industry in its day. Like back for a couple of hundred years beforehand, they had quite a thriving industry. But by 1921, it was in decline, there's no doubt about it, because once after the First World War, pipes started to be taken over by cigarettes. But there was at least 7 families involved. There were Curleys, Fitzgeralds, Coynes, Gavins, to name but a few. And they were mainly for all around Ireland. They travelled the length and breadth of the country selling them. But they also had an export industry with them. So they sold them to places of Irish immigration. A lot went to England and some went to America and Australia from here. They made thousands of them a week. They had 7 kilns in the village at one time, and a good kiln could hold up to 10,000 pipes. So they were churning them out by the millions almost every year. It was a huge boon to the economy, the pipe making industry. The historian called Isaac Weld would have done a survey in 1830s, and he mentioned that when he was travelling through the whole of Roscommon, he did a survey of the whole county, that how well dressed everybody in Knockcroghery was comparatively to other villages, and the children were very well fed. So they weren't just solely reliant on agriculture. So it was a big boon to the economy. They weren't relying on farming. But at its height, it would have had up to a couple of hundred people. So I set up the Clay Pipe Centre here on the original site of Curley's Pipe Factory more than 20 years ago. And here people can come and see the pipes been made using the original tools, which is really, really nice. And you can see the old kiln and some of the pipes that had the original historical stamps. So there were stamps that said Home Rule and Who Fears to Speak of 98. So they were done for every commemorative occasion. So for the centenary of the burning here, I have one in train that'll be for the 2021. And the crockery pipes have been found all over the world, from Australia to the Big Dig in Boston. So they travelled far and wide.
It was Sir Walter Raleigh, I think it was his name, who first brought our tobacco from America he came. He might have been a jinker, although I'd never seen, and only for him I'd never be puffin' me old Eugene. Oh my Eugene, you are so good to me, for I long to see the smoke curl up when I am through my tea. In dry and rainy weather, my friend you've always been, and upon my word I'll never ever part with me old Eugene. My wife sits up a grumbling, sure I takes it all as fun, for I know it is the only way to stop that woman's tongue. And divil the word I'll say to her, and I lets her have her fling, while up in the corner I will sit and puff me old Eugene. Oh my Eugene, you are so good to me, for I long to see the smoke curl up when I am through my tea. In dry and rainy weather, my friend you've always been, and upon my word I'll never ever part with me old Eugene. Now when I die come to my wake, you'll find lots of the old tin, and help me Bob, it's in me gob, you'll find me old Eugene. Oh my Eugene, you are so good to me, for I long to see the smoke curl up when I am through my tea. In rainy weather, my friend you've always been, and upon my word I'll never ever part with me old Eugene. Oh my Eugene, you are so good to me, for I long to see the smoke curl up when I am through my tea. In dry and rainy weather, my friend you've always been, and upon my word I'll never ever part with me old Eugene.
Yep. O'Brien's was next on the list for attack. Dennis O'Brien ran a shop and pub, and on the night a petrol bomb was thrown through the window, most likely a rock wrapped in paper, which was doused with petrol and set alight. Almost all of the dwellings in the village had thatched roofs, but O'Brien's, Curleys, Murrays and Jacksons did not, which meant they didn't catch fire as quickly. In saying that, some which had slated roofs still needed to be razed to the ground and rebuilt, such was the damage. Dennis O'Brien's son Hubert was 7 years old at the time of the attack. His son Batty and niece Joan O'Connor recount the stories they heard growing up.
It was 1 in the morning on a summer's night, and there was just so the auxiliaries turned up and they burnt the village down. There was no warning given. Just get out of the house and just grab what you could, if you could. Maybe Joan might know.
Mammy said they just
my father doesn't remember. He was too small.
Up the window there, you know where the hair saloon is there. They just shoved up the window, whatever, and threw in the petrol, and up she goes. Mammy said that. They threw it in just at that window there where the hair saloon is now.
That would have been the living room then, yeah.
Yeah.
But this piece, I don't know if it was upstairs or downstairs, but in the house. So, no. But no warning. You're told same for every house. You just grab what you could. So, well, what would you grab? Well, people didn't have a lot of possessions.
No.
You just had, maybe your post office book if you had a few bob savings or a bit of cash. But you wouldn't have a microchip or a laptop or you had nothing left.
Though the burn-in was a monumental event in the history of the village, it seems from our interview that it wasn't discussed in great detail over the years after the event. This was also the case in the O'Brien household.
There never was, and I feel, like my mother never spoke about it very much, or my father, but I don't know why. And for the pity, because we'd know more about it now,
That's true, yeah. Well, there was no cameras in those days, there was no Facebook.
Yeah.
I mean, you survive it and you probably be traumatised and, then rebuild and, get your, which happens in wars.
Yeah.
All over the globe, you resume life. My grandfather was Dennis G. O'Brien, right? Now, his premises, it was a draper's and a pub next door, right? And on the mantelpiece, possibly upstairs or downstairs, I don't know, or a sideboard, was a piece of Staffordshire pottery. Now, these pieces were made by the million. They were exported throughout the globe and throughout the empire. But this one, on the night of the fire, right, this one was on the mantelpiece. And the following day or the following week, during the clean-up, this piece was found. The remains of this piece of the two ballerinas were found in the rubble. And it's family folklore that this is the one piece that survived that fateful night in 1921.
The other thing that survived was a sewing machine. It was just inside the drawer in the hall, and I suppose it was just pulled out. Now, my Aunt Josie O'Brien, she had that down in Galway. She lived in Galway. And then we were wondering where the sewing machine was. And Uncle Jim O'Brien, his family have the sewing machine. One of his daughter's daughter, and I believe the scorch marks on the machine, on the sewing machine. Auntie Josie was great at sewing because I have old letters that Granny O'Brien sent to my mother when she was serving her time to business, and she would mention about Auntie Josie will send you this, that, and the other, your clothes that she was sewing for her, making. I know that they got 6,000 to rebuild. So that, as well as that, my mother told me that the night of the morning of the burning, the Tans, when they had done their work, they went down to the end of the village and they sat up on a cart across from Fitzgerald's. Now, Fitzgerald's was the other side of the road that time, because Breda has just informed me of that. And they sat up there and they smoked and whatever else.
At the bridge?
Yeah,
the bridge, yeah.
The house was the far side, and when it was rebuilt, it came this side.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and as another thing now that I was going to say was my father, they couldn't understand all the smoke, what was happening in Knockcroghery. And he told me afterwards, I don't know, was it that day or the next day they were going to the bog. Dominic Rogers, Walter Higgins, and my father. They were going down to the bog, down to Clooncraft, I suppose, that would be the nearest bog. And the Tans must have come on them, and they had the bottoms of their trousers was damp, and they questioned as to what they were up to, and they asked them then where they were from, and they said they were from the racecourse, and the Tans said there's no such place as the racecourse, which officially there isn't, it's Moneymore.
It's true, yeah.
John S.'s door they set aflame, which he quelled with sand and spade, as the rabble rampaged down the street to where clay pipes were made. With rifle butts they burst the doors, and the roofs they petrol bombed. Husbands, wives, and children unto the smoke-filled street were bound.
When the Black and Tans got to the location of where Murray's Bar now stands, there were two families living separately in the dwelling. In 1916, J.S. Murray bought 4 rooms of the Owens' house, and the house was split into 2.
In Murray's was the post office as well. And as we look at Murray's today, the bar would have been John S. Murray's shop. and the living room to the left of the front door would have been the post office owned by Owenses. So Owens, in fact, owned the whole building, but then when John S. Murray came to the village in 1916, he occupied 4 rooms, and the Owens family continued to live in the remaining 4 rooms, and there was 2 separate staircases for the 2 families.
And the G.S. Murray at that time was a bit of everything, like most businesses in small towns were. They had, we were undertakers. We bought wool. We bought eggs and sold them then onto hands in Roscommon. And we general meal and that kind of thing for cattle and that. And women used to come along and buy maybe a stone of chick feed for the different sorts of chicken. A bit might be Clarinda, or as they used to call it, Indian male. On the night of the burning, there would have been, my grandfather would be the G.S. Murray, Susan, his wife, my father, my Jimmy Murray, Michael Murray, and Maura. Those 3 were born. The rest hadn't come yet. So that would be 5. Most of my stuff came from my grandmother. That she heard the shout and all that, and just get out, the tans are burning in Knockcroghery. And got the kids out to be all under 4 at the time, and backed them out the door. And then she was telling about my grandfather coming when they lit at the back door, and my grandfather threw sand in or something and put it out, and they beat him up. And seemingly they beat him up quite badly. She didn't go into too much, but they brought him out and they strung him up to where they used to tie up the horses and carts at the back. And they tied him up to that. There were 2 businesses in the building, the post office, and what I'm after explaining there about the shop and the undertaking and all the rest. And the Owenses ran next door for the post office. And Mr. Owens, as I called him when I was a kid, Charlie Owens was his name. Our building wasn't burnt down because of its connection to the post office next door. They tried to set fire to it first, but because there was an interconnection between the 2 of them, Charlie Owens could see his place was going to be burnt next. And he came and he said to them, this is a post office here, and if you set fire to Murray's, the post office is going to go, and that belongs to the Crown, and you'll be in big trouble. So at that, they said, we won't go at it. They pulled back.
Well, as you know, I wasn't about at the time. But from stories that you hear that I believe the Tans came into our house and they took out my father. They were going to shoot him, and they put him up against the wall. And apparently Michael, my brother, who was only a year or so at the time, went out and told them, leave his dad alone. And one of them had taken my father's overcoat and had put it on. And again, Michael told him to take off my daddy's coat. That's just all hearsay now about they didn't shoot him anyway, as we know. He lived on to be 82 years of age before he died.
By this point in the night, the Black and Tans were all ransacking the entire village. A mob arrived at Mrs. Murray's door, also known in the village as the Widow Murray, to differentiate between her and the family next door. Her house was thatched, and the summer of 1921 had been a very hot one. Thatched roofs were like tinder boxes, with the smallest sparks setting them off. Mrs. Murray was not long a widow. With a young family, she pleaded with the mob for mercy.
The widow Murray bid them depart, this stout contrarian. 6 frightened children at her heels, she faced the ruffian gang. The widow's curse upon you, you monstrous black and tans. I hope and pray the day will come that you pay for your sins.
My great-grandmother, Mary Murray, who was in the house that night, and she was known locally as the Widow Murray because probably less than 10 years earlier, her husband had died. Actually, both her husband and who was a young man of 45, and her youngest daughter, a little baby girl of 8 months. They both died within 3 weeks of each other, and from TB. So the widow Murray had to take over the running of the pub, the licensed premises, so running the business and looking after her 6 children. So by all accounts, we know that she was a very strong lady. I suppose she had to be if she was running the business and trying to mind 6 children at the same time. And so she was tough. But on the night, she stood in the door and she more or less told them, you won't come in here. She stood firm and she gathered her children around her and said, you know, if you're going to burn this house over my dead body, will you do it? And so, according to Mamie, she stood firm. She refused to move. She gathered her children at the door, and one of the officers eventually said, leave the woman alone, leave her family alone. And they did.
I do know that there was a man living next door to us, the widow's Pat, she was called. And when he came out the next morning and looked out and all the houses were burned, and he said, Jesus, wouldn't you think they'd have done the school when they were at it? Because the school hadn't been touched, or the church, because they were under British government rules or regime or something. But that was the widow's past summing up of the effect anyway. But
well, according to the 1911 census, Pat Murray was an 11-year-old boy. So he was the youngest of the 6 of Widow Murray's children. The eldest was 18, Mary, who she was later on was Mrs. Flanagan, and we'd all remember her very well in the village, anyone that grew up in the 60s, 70s. She was a very nice woman. And one thing that I always remember about Mrs. Flanagan is that when there was thunder and lightning, we'd be sent up to Mrs. Flanagan's house. Mrs. Gordon, her neighbour, if I was up playing with the Gordons and there was thunder and lightning, she'd say, go out to Mrs. Flanagan, she's terrified. And she was actually terrified of thunder and lightning. And I often wonder, did it come from that night? And nowadays we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, I suppose. But I'd imagine the sound of the guns and the thunderous sound of roofs collapsing, it must have been just terrifying for an 18-year-old girl. And maybe the black and tans making comments as well. And they were supposed to have used a lot of rough language on that night.
Mrs. Gordon was a sister of Mrs. Owens, the postmistress. On the night in this house was Annie Gordon, her husband Eddie, and their 2-month-old baby, Vera.
Yeah, well, as far as I know, my grandfather, Edward Gordon, and his wife Annie Gordon, and they had 2 small children, my aunt and my uncle. My Uncle Joe was 4 years of age, and my Aunt Vera was approximately 2 months old on the night. Yeah, so as far as I know, that's all was actually in the house on that night. The house was burnt down. Yeah, it was a 1-story house with a thatched roof. As far as I know, it stood on the site of the house of the present house now. Yeah, so well, the burning of the village was not talked about in the house. Kind of that much, as far as I know. Yeah, as far as I can remember. Yeah, there was maybe a kind of, it was alluded to every now and then, but not too often, in my memory anyway. Yeah. My grandfather, kind of allegedly, all he took from the house before it went up in flames was his bank book. Now, he was a pragmatic man, so I would say that is probably true. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously he saved the bank book because it obviously was of great importance, of great import, and it was a physical kind of emblem of whatever it kind of represented vis-a-vis the money he actually had in the bank, obviously, and he obviously needed that. So his pragmatism obviously kicked in, and he went for that, and he got it. So yeah.
Father Bartholomew Kelly, a native of French Park, came to the village in 1919, after the death of brother Michael. He awoke to the sounds of the tans at his door. He looked out the window and saw his village in flames. At first, he refused to leave.
Well, the priest's house went on fire. As we know, the priest ran upstairs and the black and tans burst in the door and they set fire to his library. And in the meantime, his neighbours, or in some of the reports it says his servants, came to his aid and they helped him out an upstairs window. And then after that, when the tans had left, he hid in a field of oats, was in one of the newspaper reports as well. But a group of local people came to his aid. One of them that's mentioned in some of the reports is a woman called Jenny Quigley. And whether Jenny worked with the priest, we're not sure, but she lived opposite the priest's house. And she helped put out the fire with sand and water. And it said in one of the reports that they were convenient to the house. So there must have been a bit of building or something going on, that there was sand there and water. And they succeeded in saving the house. So Jenny is a kind of a bit of a hero or a heroine of the night.
Yeah, when I was doing research on the burning of Knockcroghery, in my innocent mind I thought I'd see a newspaper heading saying Knockcroghery burned to the ground, banner headlines and so on. But that wasn't the case. There was nothing that following week in the local Roscommon papers, the Roscommon Journal or the Roscommon Messenger. But I did find an article in the Strokestown Democrat. And a very innocent heading said, Father Bartley Kelly discommoded. And I knew Father Kelly was the PP here, so I thought I'm onto something here. And I started to read it. And it was a very innocent sort of account of the burning of Knockcroghery. And this would appear to be a case of self-censorship by the editor of the paper, who, if he wrote the truth and wrote it in banner headlines, he'd probably end up with his offices and printing work burned to the ground.
Father Kelly and the Church of Ireland canon, Thomas Humphreys, were both in their 40s and very friendly, which would be unusual for the time.
They were very good friends, and it was probably not normal at the time because of the political unrest that was going on in the country and the tensions that were there. So it was unique really in that sense that they had a very good and strong friendship, and relations in the community were very good between the Catholic and the Protestant congregations. But that was due, I'd say, to the two men getting on very well and having very good relationships. So as I say, he got out a back window and headed across the fields and was received very graciously by his good friend, Canon Humphreys, and his wife. And he wasn't the only one that was taking refuge and sanctuary there. Many of the villagers had made their way to Canon Humphreys' house and were looking for solace there, and indeed received that. They left in the middle of the night. I mean, most of the villagers were asleep when this started, and so they just left with the few bits they had. And the rector and his wife provided food and shelter and clothing for the villagers that went to the house on that night. There was a lot of damage done to the house internally, particularly the furniture, and Father Kelly had an extensive library with very valuable books, and that was destroyed completely. So internally there was a lot of damage done. The fact that the house was a slated house, it kind of preserved it, and in fact they were able to put out the flames and the blaze. But because the library was such a unique one and rare books, Father Kelly was compensated for that, and at the time it was £200, which was a lot of money. So it just shows you the value of the books that he had in his possession. I think it was a devastating effect on the villagers at the time, and they were traumatised. It was a night of terror, really, and I think a lot of people, it took a long time for them to get over that. I do think, yes, businesses and the life of the village suffered a lot as a result of that. But it did build up in people a resilience, and there was, as I say, a common goal that they wouldn't be defeated and that they would repair the damage done and do their best in trying to build up the village again.
Canon Humphreys, his wife and children lived in the glebe. He was well known for hosting regular picnics at Gailey Bay for members of his congregation. Those villagers who'd escaped up the hill and through the summer meadows had converged on the glebe. He opened his door to the new homeless people of Knockcroghery and offered refuge in terms of clothing and food for those in need.
My first recollection of hearing about the burning of Knockcroghery was from my late father, who at the time of the burning was actually 5 years old and living in his home place in Four Roads. Benny Lane was his name, and although we were reared in Dublin, we were every day told about stories of Roscommon. And the burning of Knockcroghery was a huge story then. Even though he was 5 years old, he remembered, and he remembered the tension and, you know, the feeling around, and also the charity element that people were giving, and within days people were giving to the people of Knockcroghery. I believe that the church could hold 300 people. I don't know about the numbers in Knockcroghery, but I suppose after the time of Canon Humphreys, the numbers began to dwindle. And I think in 1966, the church was finally demolished, unfortunately, and it was such a shame. But I think the stone in the church was used for St. Michael's Church in Ballinasloe. It was similar to the stone that had been used there. And I think that's what happened. And I'm sure there are people in the village still who have maybe grandparents or parents who remember that awful day when they blew up the church and stones landed. I think Anne Gordon at the time remembered that stones went over the top of the houses, and fortunately nobody was injured, but it was a terrible shame. Canon Humphreys was a rector here from 1912 until he left here in the 20s, I think, yeah. And he moved on then into Roscommon, but he was a very kind man. I know that he used to hold picnics up in Gailey Bay with local people and with his own parishioners. And I know there was a great tradition here of people coming from the services in the church up to the house here and having bread and jam and tea. That was the usual, you know, the parishioners were welcome to come up here always. So I think he was a very kind and generous man. And I think he showed that on the night of the burning. And I know Anne-Marie Murray, in her lovely book that she's just recently published, she covers that very nicely about the people who came up here from the village, and particularly the children who came up from the village after that terrible nightmare of seeing their houses burnt down, and that they were shown that lovely kindness by Reverend Humphreys and his wife and family. And they were clothed and fed and given a place to sleep. And I think that speaks for itself. And also the fact that Father Kelly from the church here came across the fields and hid in a field of oats and came here and was put up and facilitated here and accommodated by Reverend Humphreys. And the two, it seemed that they were great friends. It seemed that Father Kelly had a great collection of books and theology which were destroyed in the fire, and I suppose he and maybe Reverend Humphreys had discussions about theology when they were here together, which was lovely to think that in Knockcroghery during the burning and after the burning in those days, that those discussions took place regardless of the bigger picture outside and all the discontent and the war and the troubles that were going on, that there was this lovely relationship between the two men here, and that they were able to discuss all of that. So that was probably a positive that came out of the awful burning of Knockcroghery. I know that the night of the burning, you know, was just, I can imagine what it was like. I often look out of here when there's a sunset and it seems like the village is on fire, you know, and I often think what it must have been like that night for those families and those children with no notice given. And, you know, coming up through the avenue there in their night attire, probably cold and scared and frightened, to be met with the kindness that they were met with here was such a great thing for them in those days. Canon Humphreys and his wife gave them clothes, gave them food. the following morning, there was porridge and hot sweet tea served here outside to everybody. And also Canon Humphrey and his wife and family donated clothes to all the people who came up, because many of them had nothing, only their night attire. And in the days that followed, I know that some people in the village, including the village postman, were wearing the canon's clothes. But, you know, I think also there was a huge effort made, and it was really a joint initiative between Reverend Humphreys and Father Kelly. They got together with other people and they formed a committee. And there was money given through the White Cross, which was an organisation for the distribution of American funding. And that arrived very quickly in Knockcroghery. And there was a huge response, you know, from local people as well and from all around the other townlands to the plight of people in Knockcroghery. I recently found a notebook belonging to Fred Jackson, who is the next resident of the house. And in that notebook, he details, it was dated actually the 19th of July 1921, just a few weeks after the burning. And in that notebook, he details his customers and items that he had sold them. And there's a record of him selling a red heifer to Reverend Humphreys. But, you know, after that, there are very few entries of anything, because I would say that people were destitute. And so Fred Jackson didn't have a lot of customers. And other notebooks that I've found since then, maybe in the 30s and 40s, are full of, you know, the sales of sheep and lambs and all sorts of things, habits and God knows what. But that particular notebook has very few entries in it. And I'd imagine because it was a few weeks after the burning that people really didn't have anything to spend, you know. They were very much dependent on the goodwill of the local people.
The Lyons family were also pipe makers in the village. Pat Lyons was a boy of 14, and on that night the Black and Tan set fire to their home, leaving him and his family homeless. His son Michael retells the story of that fateful night.
There was no word about the burning. There was no word about the burning. So there wasn't. It was all burned, and what could they do? What could you do if your house was burned? But my father was here at the time of the burning. And he was 14. And all he could do was, he went up across the green. Hangman's Hill. He headed for Hangman's Hill. And he went back down to Jackson's, to be honest. And that was it. There was no come back. He had no clue. My father lived in he slept in the horse's cart for a couple of years, below the shed. All the women of the village around about here, them all lived in the fort for a couple of years there. That was a lot of them. That's where they lived, above in the fort. And I don't know how long they lived, but they were in it for a good while. There was no other where to go. The fort was there. There was lots of trees and lots of cover, and that was it. There were ruins there, but they were all fixed up and they were all built up again. There was a lot of buildings down here in the village. So there was. You can think about it the way it was burned. And there was no houses, and it was all built up after. Took a while, it took time, but it was done. And then the last few years, that built it. Look at the way the village is gone. Another 100 houses in it. And we're back to a new village now again.
Mike also recalls how the fire and its aftermath led to the spate of emigration.
They went to America and they went to England. And they never came back. The girl in England came back a few times now. I remember her coming back. So I do. She was Mrs. Coburn. Yeah. And she came back every 5 or 6 years. She came back good few times. But the two ladies went to America. They never came back. They went, and that was it. Good luck.
Sweetheart, I'm bidding you a fond farewell. I will be yours someday. I'm off to a new land, my fortunes to try, and I'm ready to sail away. Far away in Australia, soon fate will be kind, and I will be ready to welcome at last that girl I left behind. No, you can't leave me, the young maid said, I cannot let you go. But I must leave you, I softly replied, but only for a while, you know. Far away in Australia, soon fate will be kind, and I will be ready to welcome the lass, that girl I left behind. Whether in success or failure, I will always be true. Proudly each day in that land far away, I'm building a home for you. Far away in Australia, soon fate will be mine, and I will be ready to welcome at last that girl I left behind. Spending each day at that old cottage gate, watching the day pass through. Then a message came from the sea, and I'm hoping this time is true. Far away in Australia, now has come the time where I will be ready to welcome at last that girl I left behind. That girl I left behind.
The village would have been asleep when the Black and Tans arrived. A nighttime curfew was enforced across the island at that time. The Tans would have caused chaos, shooting weapons and screaming. That would have awoken the village very quickly. Families took to the street to see what the commotion was, and upon seeing the Black and Tans ransacking the village, would have fled up Hangman's Hill and Cregan Hill with haste. The reputation of brutality from the Tans would indicate that any man who chose to fight back would risk injury, imprisonment or possibly death. The priority became getting families to safety as quickly as possible. Most would have fled in their night clothes.
And Annie was our grandmother, Annie Coyne. And the Coynes were one of the clay pipe families. One of the number of families who made the clay pipes around that time. And in Knockcroghery, as I say, you don't recall Dad saying much about the burning, really. You know, well, my Aunt Maureen was the one who really spoke about it.
Yeah, and she was the eldest in our family. And again, no more than what a lot of the other family members here. It wasn't something that was really spoken about that much, you know, the actual burning itself. But again, no more than what the other families would have shared, you know, again, memories about being given very little time to leave the house, and the whole thing was having to run up the back up to Hangman's Hill.
They were directly affected. There was a business. There were two sisters. They were the last of our great-grandfather was the last pipe maker, Martin, and he was born about 1859. And his two sisters had the shop at the bottom of the village, Elizabeth and Bridget, who were known as Betty and Beezy.
Beezy and Betty, yeah.
And they were Coyne. And they were in business on the night of the burning at the bottom of the village, close to Andrew Curley's. And that business was burnt out that night. I remember Maureen telling me this. She ran in her night clothes along with her aunts up to Hangman's Hill. They got no time at all, no warning. It's my understanding our grandfather Tom was not around
and he would have been a prime target if he was at the time.
Yeah.
But the two sisters would have been elderly enough around that time. They'd have been in their late 60s, 70s, I'd say, but that was, so they were burnt out, their business was burnt out. There was a small factory at the back of their shop.
You mean Killins?
Killins, yeah. And they were burnt out, so that was the end of it. But
after the burning, the relocation, and there was a great solidarity in the village. With the Coyne family would have to relocate up to O'Brien's and Murray's, at that time.
That's right. It was the end of the Coynes in Knockcroghery after 300 years. That's probably the most remarkable thing about the burning. Indirectly, is that the Coynes were there for 300 years. There's records going back. They weren't always pipe makers, but they were in the area. And as a result of that, all the boys, bar one, immigrated.
Paddy
stayed behind. Paddy was the eldest, and he stayed behind.
Yeah.
He died in the 60s, 1961. Our granny, who had to run up the hill that time, she became the local school teacher, but she married Tom Rogers. That's our grandfather. Yeah. And then Delia married Dominic Rogers.
Two sisters married two brothers. Two Coynes married two Rogers.
But the Coyne family name finished after the burning. I think that has to be said, This, just in passing, this is a clay pipe mould. Michael Murray and I, Jamesy's son, we were kids playing on the old, this is important, the old factory site, not the Coyne one, the William Curley site down at the bottom of the village. We were just kids, and it was pure rubble, and we were just walking through, and we saw what looked like a basket sticking out under stones, and the stones were burnt. I remember that, and we just pulled out the basket. It was a full basket of moulds, and we were allowed to keep one as a memento. So that's a clay pipe mould that survived the burning.
The Fitzgeralds lived at the end of the village where the post office is now located.
Well, the Fitzgeralds lived where the post office is now. And there was Patrick Fitzgerald and Ella, which would be my grandfather, or our grandfather. And they had 3 kids, Edward, Mary, and Bridget. Edward, Mary, and James. And Bridget, Patrick's sister, lived in the house also. And on the night of the burning, they were just pulled out of their beds. The house was set on fire, the thatch of it, and they ran up Hangman's Hill in their night clothes, and they ended up in Canon Humphrey's house.
But I suppose they were so young at that time when it happened. Teddy would be only about 10, I suppose. Mary would have been maybe 13, and Jimmy would only been 8 or 9. And they'd only hear it from their fathers.
Just that they ran up the hill in their night clothes, and it was frightening for them, I suppose, being pulled out of the beds, at that night. And they went up at Hangman's Hill at the back, and up into
Jackson's, I think, that time, I think Dunhu's and Jackson's were the only two on the other side, wasn't it?
And the Fitzgeralds that time. But they built in across the road from that then when the new house was built. Never heard much about Mrs. Curley's.
No, I don't know who was living, whether they were living there. Like they lived in Curley-Mart, John Curley. And then when Margaret Curley died, they moved down to Knockcroghery. So who was there in Curley's house with? Probably William Curley. He used to do the pipes and all.
They were supposed to have sat on a cart and smoked at the end of the village when they had burnt down the village. And there was also tellings of it that they had a few drinks. That was before they headed up Shrat then out of the village, which was the road out of Knockcroghery. They went up the back way. They probably couldn't go back up through the village.
In the cold light of day, the village was a smouldering shell. Families from the village were relocated wherever possible.
As far as we know, a lot of people were taken in by Canon Humphreys and Father Kelly. They looked after people, and some people also went to relations. houses for that night and probably for the next day, because I'd imagine there was still a lot of fear around. There was women with small babies, old people, so I'm sure they were reluctant to come back the next day, so they probably stayed away for a couple of days. But as for what people did afterwards, the only real account we have is account that from an interview that Declan Coyne did with my father, Jamesy, in 2002, and it was for the 75th anniversary of the Roscommon champion. So he asked him that question: where did people go after the burning? So he listed off most of the families that were here. Some of the families weren't listed, but I suppose he was a man in his 80s at the time, so his memory mightn't have been so great. They say there was 15 houses burnt down at that time. So of the families that were mentioned in the article that I mentioned that my father was interviewed in, he talked about the Conyans and the O'Briens both went to Shra. And there was 2 houses there had been built for farm labourers. It was a new scheme that had come in, and they were probably built between 1916 and 1920. And the 2 men that lived in those houses were Ned Bentley and Harry Tracy. So they moved out of those houses and they gave them to the 2 families, which was very good of them. And at least they were housed. And then we know that Curleys, from where Ethel lives now, that they went over to Culleen, and they lived in a house that was uninhabited at the time, but it was owned by a man called Robert Payne, and he was the landowner over there. We know that the Gordons were able to save part of their house, so they continued to live there. We know that the Jackson ladies, they had 2 houses on the far side of the street, and one of those houses could be kept, and they were able to live there while their house was being rebuilt. And then other people weren't so fortunate. You had the Fitzgeralds and the Lyonses. They both had to make do with outhouses that they turned into living quarters. So I'm sure it wasn't very comfortable for them. The Fitzgeralds had 3 small children. Murtaghs and Murrays all we managed to hold on to our houses. I think the Curleys at the bottom of the street as well, where what they always called William Curleys. They went up to Cornamart. They had relations there called Tulises, so that's where they lived until their house was rebuilt. They had lost their pipe factory as well, and the 2 factories were gone. But by all accounts, the industry was in decline. So they would have changed their business to farming, and they also had a shop for a time before my time. So the youngest resident in Knockcroghery was a Murtagh baby who would have been a month old, and the next youngest was Vera Gordon, who was 2 months old. So there would have been, I think there was 4 babies under 1 that night.
On the 23rd of June, the matter was mentioned in the House of Parliament in Westminster, London.
Can I ask the Chief Secretary whether his attention has been called to the burning of the village Knockcroghery, County Roscommon on Monday night last, 20th of June, whether a force of armed and masked men arrived in motor cars and, without giving the occupants of the houses a chance of dressing or retrieving their property, proceeded to burn the houses, whether a fusillade of rifle and revolver firing was carried out during the operation, the inhabitants having to fly from their burning homes into the fields in just their night attire, whether only 3 houses escaped destruction, and what steps have been taken towards justice against those responsible for this barbarous outrage.
According to a police report which I have received, a party of armed and disguised men invaded the village of Knockcroghery about 1 a.m. on the 21st instant and proceeded to burn down a number of houses in the village. The occupiers of the houses were turned out in their night attire and were not given any opportunity of saving any part of their property. The report does not state that a fusillade of fire was carried on during the destruction. It mentioned that 1 man was fired upon, though not injured. Inhabitants of the village are not able to identify any of the persons who committed these outrages, but the matter is being carefully investigated by the police and military authorities.
Will the Right Honourary and learned gentleman inform the House what is the character of investigation that is taking place into this outrage?
Inquiry has been made to the Royal Irish Constabulary and the military authorities in reference to this matter. The Royal Irish Constabulary are very actively engaged in trying to trace the perpetrators.
As we have not the slightest hope that anything will come out of this investigation, may I ask, as he has now admitted, that a whole village has been practically destroyed by armed men in the dead of night, whether he will appoint an impartial inquiry to investigate this matter and try to get at the truth about something in Ireland.
Were there any assassinations or murders in the neighbourhood just before this occurred? No, not in that neighbourhood. General Lambert was buried about 10 miles away on the other side of Lochreed.
Will the right honorary and learned gentleman take steps to have some impartial tribunal appointed to inquire into this wholesale destruction of an Irish village? We have not been able to find the malefactors guilty of any of these crimes by these tribunals which he has set up, and we want to get at the truth about something in Ireland.
It will be necessary to try and ascertain the perpetrators before there can be any question of an inquiry.
Engineer Patrick John Raftery in Roscommon Town was hired to come into the village and assess the damage to their premises and decide the best way forward to rebuilding Knockcroghery.
An engineer called Raftery came out from Roscommon Town to, at the instructions of obviously some of the people in the village, to put an estimate on the damages to their property. And in his notebook, as he entered the village, he noted that Roscommon or Knockcroghery still smoulders like a lime kiln. And he did his initial investigation and he saw obviously the roof was off houses that he was looking at. The window frames were gone, the doors were gone, but he felt that perhaps new roof, new doors, new windows would set things in motion and rapidly get things back into living conditions. But when he returned on another job a few days later, the house that he'd previously been looking at, the gable ends and the front walls had collapsed. And what had happened was the intense heat of the fire had expanded the walls. And then as they cooled down, the lime mortar fell out from between the stones. And then the stones fell, the gable ends fell down. And it meant then that it was a complete rebuild for that particular building.
No inquiry was ever made into the burning, but when people received their compensation, they were anxious to rebuild their lives. After the Civil War, people lived in what was now the new Irish Free State and wanted to put these troubled years behind them.
I suppose one of the things I would never have thought about with the burning before, I mean, we all learned it in school. We knew that there were so many houses destroyed and we knew the Black and Tans came and they were loud and people had to put their lives together afterwards, and that was all very admirable of the people. But I never thought about, I suppose, of the women and children really on the night, and the old people, how vulnerable they would have felt. And in the months and years afterwards, that there was women bringing up small children and that their houses and all they possessed had been taken away, so that their lives were just changed in one night, and they had to pick up the pieces. And I think it was the women with the small babies. They still had to feed their children, they still had to clothe their children, bring them to school. All that still had to continue. And I think we should remember them as well as being very brave and resilient that night.
I think there was a huge stoicism in that generation. I think they built this country. I mean, they were at the cutting edge. They were the ones who ran up the hill, and I think they saw a lot of revolution and change and the birth of a young country. And I think that they were incredibly stoic. And I'd say that it was kind of, it happened, and I don't. It's funny. I don't recall any of my. I don't remember our grand aunt Delia. Now I do remember talking to her about it. There wasn't. Never got any sense of huge bitterness or anything. It's funny. I know. I'm sure it was there, but I never recall any kind of. The Black and Tans who did it were regarded as what they were, a crowd of degenerate, ill-disciplined criminals, and I think people knew that, and But I just don't think that. I just think there was a stores, and I think they got on with it, you know. And I don't recall any. It's funny. It's funny. There should be not vocalized anyway as much. Maybe you.
It's a good point, because I think that even growing up in the Knockcroghery, there were great characters in the place, and stoicism is one. But there was almost like an irreverence, or that we're not going to be beaten by this. They were not the spirit. The spirit wasn't going to be downtrodden.
That's the word.
And I thought that the people in the village were very much proud, and there were great characters.
You're spot on. You know, I mean, that's the word. Yeah. It was pride, and you just as you were saying, it came to me. And there was the pride of Barclay Kelly, the canon, who stood up to them, the priest. There was the pride of the widow Murray. You know, there was a pride in them that they stood up, you know, as well. They got no chance. I mean, they had to run like this was absolute terrorism, you know, a terrorist act, you know. But there was a pride. There was a lot of, you know, the widows, you know, the widows Pat and the widow Murray and Barclay and everybody else. There was a pride in how they'd stood up as well, I think, you know. And I mean, they certainly weren't defeated, Will. That's an important point.
I think if you were to try and identify a spirit in a Knockcroghery, was very much that, and that sense of identity and a community. There's a real strong sense of community about that, and building a community out of, you know, literally the embers of the village, you know, and building a community, and it brought people together. I think that's what forged that strong sense of identity. I think that's the legacy that we inherited.
Absolutely.
You know,
I think that's it, and it's a very good question, Will. And you know, I think that generation that night were determined that they weren't going to be bitter. They were community builders. They were country builders. They were nation builders. And as you say, they were able to stand up and say, "We're still here." And look at the legacy now. You know, it's and something I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of my community.
And here we are 100 years after the event, and we're still talking about it. And we're commemorating, I believe, very much that spirit.
2021 is a year of commemoration, but it's also one of remembrance. The story's been resurrected so that it can be passed on to future generations. One person doing that is my own sister, Anne-Marie Murray, who has created an illustrated children's book about the event.
I always knew that I wanted to write a children's book and illustrate a children's book. In particular, I was very interested with the village, and not just the burning. Although we have a great history with Clay Pipe, Hangman's Hill and the burning, even stories about the bar, things that my granddad would have told me, and about legends in the Knockcroghery, and even stories from behind the bar. But in this case, now that it's 100 years this year since the burning, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to write about it. I was always very aware of the burning and had heard many stories about it. We learnt about it in school, as well as my grandfather had often told us stories, and I'd heard stories, you know, through the village. I was aware of it, and I thought that I was educated enough on it, I suppose, until I went to actually read about it. And when I dived into things, there was so much that I didn't know about it. And that's what really surprised me at this project. It was a learning experience for me.
The villagers got their lives back together. The clay pipe manufacturing ended, but the village continued to be associated with it to this day. Down through the last 100 years, the village has experienced ups and downs like everywhere else. A highlight was in 1943 and 44, when the Sam Maguire Cup was held here in Roscommon after winning 2 All-Ireland finals. The 1950s and 60s saw a lot of emigration. The village fairs, another important revenue stream for Knockcroghery, continued until the 1970s. But as livestock marts were constructed, they too died away. They enjoyed a brief revival in the 1990s, which lived on into the 2000s. However, in the last decade, these two have seen their end. Today, our challenge is a global pandemic. But no doubt, Knockcroghery will come back stronger.
It would have been wonderful to have an event this year for the 100 years, because I know a lot of families would have liked to use it as a reason to gather and have a celebration in the village. I suppose celebration is the wrong word, but to commemorate, but also to celebrate the fact that we're all here, that our families survived that night, because it could have gone horribly wrong. and that it was such a pity that we can't do that. But I'd hope that next year we'll be able to meet up, and we'll be actually marking people's a year later. So it'll be a different type of celebration. We'll be remembering the fact that everybody was a year on after the burning. We'll be a year on after the pandemic, we hope, and there'll be a great cause for celebration.
Have you ever been down to the side of Knockcroghery, where the fields they are green and the people so gay? It was there that I first met with sweet Molly Doherty, laughing and singing and making the hay. Oh Molly, come on, I'll tease you now, Molly, come on, I'll please you now, Molly, come on, I'll bet you a song. It is better diversion than making the hay. There's a Soggart Aroon there below in Knockcroghery. Quickly I found him that fine summer day, and he tied me up tightly to sweet Molly Doherty. Thrushes and linnets were singing away. Oh Molly, come on, I'll tease you now, Molly, come on, I'll please you now, Molly, come on, I'll bet you a song. It is better diversion than making the hay. Oh, it's 50 long years since we came from Knockcroghery. Our eyes they are dim and our hair it is grey. But if ever sweet Molly attempts to get cross with me, I sit down beside her and wobble away. Oh Molly, come on, I'll tease you now, Molly, come on, I'll please you now, Molly, come on, I'll bet you a song. It is better diversion than making the hay. Oh Molly, come on, I'll tease you now, Molly, come on, I'll please you now, Molly, come on, I'll bet you a song. It is better diversion than making the hay. That's the best. Yeah. That'll work all right.